Hey guys. So, one of the best ways to understand the history of American politics is to think of it as a pendulum. Over the course of American history, the pendulum has swung back and forth between eras of liberalism and conservatism. And in the 1980s, there was resurgence in conservatism within American politics. So, today we are going to seek to define the ideas of this conservative movement and explore its root causes. So, the conservatism that emerged in the 1980s, or New Right, as it was sometimes called, can be defined by a few key characteristics. First, the new right was suspicious of federal power. It wanted to place greater limits on the size and power of the national government, and in doing so, conservatives wanted to shift power to individual states and the people. Connected to this belief in limited government was concerns over taxes and government spending. The new right sought to ease government regulations on business. They wanted to reduce taxes. They also wanted to eliminate government spending on welfare programs. Additionally, many in the New Right were alarmed by social and cultural changes that were occurring in American society. Conservatives of the 1980s denounced abortion, feminism, homosexuality, and affirmative action. Meanwhile, they fought to include prayer in schools and pushed for tougher penalties for criminals. Finally, the conservative movement of the 1980s sought to take a tougher stance against communism abroad and increase America's military strength overall. For many members of the New Right, strengthening America's military was the best way to deter tyranny overseas and maintain world peace. So, the New Right's philosophies can be traced back to the 1960s, specifically the candidacy of Barry Goldwater in 1964. Prior to the 1960s, the face of the Republican Party had been Dwight D. Eisenhower, whose modern republicanism was considered to be a more moderate approach to politics. Eisenhower was fiscally conservative and had championed budget cuts to reduce federal spending. But he also accepted earlier expansions of government under FDR's New Deal, leaving Social Security intact. Barry Goldwater represented a more extreme form of conservatism, and he was a stark contrast to the liberal principles of Lyndon B. Johnson. The Goldwater campaign attacked the federal income tax, he attacked Social Security, civil rights legislation, and the nuclear test ban treaty. He also opposed the expansion of governmental authority under the Great Society. And while Goldwater appealed to many conservative Americans at the time, in the end, he was overwhelmingly defeated in the election of 1964 by LBJ. So, how did Goldwater's more conservative agenda become a major force in politics by the 1980s? Let's take a look at the various factors that led to the rise of conservatism by the 1980s. So, the first major cause of the rise of conservatism in the 1980s was the expansion of government, which had occurred throughout most of the 20th century. Throughout the 20th century, the federal government had been taking on new responsibilities and expanding their role in the lives of Americans. For instance, the New Deal had established a limited welfare state with programs such as Social Security. This expansion of government continued under LBJ's Great Society, with programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and other programs that were designed to help the poor. Conservatives of the 1980s disliked these programs because they believed that they destroyed rugged individualism and created a system where people became more permanently reliant on the government. Others criticized the effectiveness of such programs. Many members of the New Right argued that the federal government was ineffective when it came to solving many local problems. They pointed to programs such as the Great Society's Model Cities, which was tasked with urban renewal and was shut down by 1974. To many conservatives, programs such as Model Cities was proof that the federal government should have a smaller role in the lives of its citizens. So we can see evidence of the conservative backlash against the expansion of government growing as early as the Nixon administration. Though Nixon was a moderate and did a great deal actually to expand the role of government with programs such as the Environmental Protection Agency, for instance, he did share many conservatives' belief that more responsibilities should be given to states. A great example of Nixon's shift away from the expansion of government was his program of New Federalism. So New Federalism was the process of taking certain powers from the federal government and transferring it back to the states and local governments. Nixon's new federalism established a revenue sharing system, which would give block grants to states and local governments to address their individualized needs. Ronald Reagan took this process to a new level with his policy of deregulation and what became known as Reaganomics. Mrs. Ulrich will go into greater depth about Reaganomics in a later lecture, but what you do need to know is that a big part of Reaganomics is in the process of cutting federal regulations on business as well as government spending on social programs. Now, a second major cause for the rise of conservatism was an increasing mistrust in the federal government. There were several events in the 1960s that made Americans question the federal government and whether or not they were being honest with the public. One of the first events that caused this was the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963. So the assassination of JFK shocked and scarred the nation, which suddenly felt very vulnerable. The publication of the Warren Commission report in 1964, which detailed the investigation into the Kennedy assassination, was really controversial. So the Warren Commission's findings were almost immediately challenged by many Americans who believed that the assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, did not act alone. The assassination led to a rise in conspiracy thinking within the United States that persists even to this day. This belief in large government cover-ups and conspiracies eroded trust between Americans and the federal government, even as many of these conspiracies proved to be untrue. Americans who believed that the government was actually hiding things, specifically information about stuff like the JFK assassination, were also more likely to agree with conservative calls for smaller government and a decrease in the federal power. The Vietnam War further eroded American trust in the government because as the war progressed, a credibility gap emerged between what the government was telling the American people and what the public was actually seeing on the news. The Tet Offensive was particularly damaging to public opinion about the war because up to that point, the U.S. government was claiming that it was winning. However, as news networks broadcast images of South Vietnam under attack, many Americans came to the conclusion that the Vietnam War could not be won, and public opinion turned against it. Compounding the suspicion of the government was the leaked Pentagon Papers in 1971. So the Pentagon Papers was a secret government report detailing American policy decisions in Vietnam that was leaked and published by the New York Times. The Pentagon Papers revealed instances of government lying as well as mismanagement of the Vietnam War, and further damaged America's faith in the central government. Finally, the Watergate scandal did a great deal of damage to the reputation of the presidency and the federal government in 1974. President Nixon's resignation, which came amongst allegations that he attempted to cover up a burglary at the Democratic Party headquarters, cast further doubt on the integrity of the federal government and convinced many Americans in the 1970s that a smaller, limited central government was the best political philosophy moving forward. Now, a third major reason for the rise of the new right was the major social and cultural changes that were occurring in the 1960s and 1970s. The 1960s proved to be a very liberal era in American history, and it gave rise to many new social movements. The Civil Rights Movement helped create major legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Second wave feminism created greater awareness for inequalities that existed in the workplace, and as well as a lack of access to education. It helped women to get access to birth control, and it also led eventually to the Roe v. Wade decision that gave women access to legal abortions. The youth movement, the gay rights movement, the American Indian movement. Many of these movements had their roots in the social and cultural upheaval of the 1960s and 70s. So concerns over social issues brought together many conservative Americans who worried about these changes and what they would mean for traditional values. In some cases, politicians even played on fears of change in order to build new coalitions. For example, Richard Nixon used the white backlash against the civil rights movement to realign many Southern states in what became known as the Southern Strategy. Playing on white fears of integration, Richard Nixon was able to appeal to the traditionally Democratic South by stressing issues of law and order and remaining non-committal on civil rights issues. Richard Nixon also attempted to court what he described as the silent majority. Now, according to Nixon and his administration, the silent majority were middle-class Americans who generally supported the Vietnam War and were, for the most part, turned off by the ideas of the counterculture. They were also opposed to the anti-war movement and other civil rights protesters. Now, the prevalence of the silent majority continues to be a source of historical debate. However, it is fair to say that many middle-class conservatives were becoming increasingly alarmed by the growing radicalism of groups such as the SDS, SNCC, and the Weathermen. Now, the conservative movement of the 1980s grew in response also to the feminist movement of the 1960s and the 1970s. Perhaps no other issue united conservatives more than the issue of abortion. The Roe v. Wade decision, which gave women access to abortions during the first term of their pregnancy, became a rallying point for many conservatives, resulting in an organized pro-life movement that still exists today. The growth of women in the workplace and the proposed Equal Rights Amendment also experienced stiff resistance from anti-feminists, who associated the expansion of women's rights with the decline in American family values. They blamed second-wave feminism for the increased divorce rate, which tripled between 1960 and 1980. Conservative political leaders such as Phyllis Schlafly emerged to stop parts of the feminist agenda, most notably the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA for short. Anti-feminists like Phyllis Schlafly, argued that the ERA would destroy spousal benefits under Social Security, as well as gender-specific restrooms and exemptions for women during a military draft. These arguments, as well as fears that the ERA would erode the family structure within the United States, led to the amendment's defeat by 1982. Other conservative groups took aim at legislation that was designed to break down systemic racism and de facto segregation. Now, these issues, especially de facto segregation, still existed throughout a large part of the country, especially in northern regions of the United States. Government programs to integrate racially segregated neighborhoods through busing, as well as affirmative action programs, were denounced by many conservatives. Affirmative action is the policy of giving preference to minorities and women in job hiring, admissions to universities, as well as awarding of government contracts. It was started actually under LBJ as part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it was intended to make up for past discrimination. Conservatives argued that affirmative action constituted reverse discrimination, and cases arose to challenge the program, such as the Bakke case in 1978. In Regents of the University of California v. Bakke, Jim Bakke, a white man, argued that he had been unfairly denied admission to medical school due to affirmative action policies at the university. Despite the conservative push to overturn the law, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of affirmative action, making it constitutional to use race as a factor in college admissions. Though the Bakke case did limit affirmative action to a certain extent. It did so by limiting the use of quotas. Now, a fourth cause of the rise of conservatism was the influence of religion on politics. Coinciding with the growing backlash against some of the social movements of the 1960s and 70s was a new religious revival that was occurring in America. Known as the religious right, this religious revival consisted of conservative evangelical Christians who were concerned by the sexual permissiveness of the counterculture and the sexual revolution. They were also concerned about the legalization of abortion, feminism, increased rates of divorce, as well as gay rights. The religious right of the 1980s differed from earlier eras in that religious groups began to form political organizations in order to lobby the government and influence elections. Jerry Falwell founded the Moral Majority, which was a political organization that championed conservative causes. The Moral Majority was able to reach a large number of Americans thanks to radio, direct marketing, and most importantly, cable TV. Televangelists helped push the beliefs of the religious right, registering millions of voters and raising huge sums of money to support candidates who were pro-life, supported prayer in school, and other conservative issues. Now, all of these issues culminated in the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, whose presidency set a more conservative tone for the nation. A presidency which we are going to continue to look at in future lectures. But for now, take care.